Today we're going to go through the process of doing a quick patch in drywall to repair medium to large sized holes. I've built this fake wall with a 4-foot sheet of drywall on it for demonstration purposes. These stud bays are 16 inches on center, just like a traditional wall. This method could also be used to patch even larger holes than the ones I demonstrate here. So the first thing that we'll need to do is create a hole. With that done, let's move on to what the necessary requirements are here. Typically speaking, you'll be using a 2x4 as the support board behind the patch, but you could always use smaller pieces of wood if you wished. If you're going with a 2x4 though, you'll need a minimum of 3.5 inches for the 2x4 to fit in the hole. Since this hole is rather small, we're going to measure out a square 3.5 inches around the hole. The main thing is to make sure you have a square or rectangular hole instead of a round hole. I've seen some weird videos on Facebook and such where people try to patch the odd shaped hole that's in their wall, and don't do that. It makes no sense. Find out how large the hole is, then mark out flat lines around it so you have an even piece to work with. I recommend going to the closest ½ inch or full inch to make your life easier. In this case, I went with 3.5 inches on all 4 sides, and then used a level to make sure that the lines were straight. I highly recommend a 9-inch torpedo level as it serves a ton of purposes around the house with repairs. Typically speaking, you would never use a Sharpie on drywall as it can end up bleeding through the paint whenever you go to paint it. That won't be an issue here due to the fact that it'll be covered by drywall mud, but also I'm only using it so it actually is visible on camera. Normally, I just use a mechanical pencil. As I mentioned, a 2x4 is 3.5 inches wide, as demonstrated here. For those unaware, lumber is not actually the size it claims it is, but we're not going to get into that whole discussion here. The point here is that the 2x4 will fit in this hole when we cut it out. You can also see how it'll end up sitting behind the wall in between the stud bays. If your hole was partially on a stud, that's perfectly fine. You just cut your hole a little longer so the 2x4 or whatever piece of wood you're using can fit inside of it. Time to start making more of a mess. Grab your trusty drywall saw and be careful with it. They're quite sharp and will leave a nasty cut if you're not careful. These things are super simple to use and they're like 10 bucks. No need for the fancy drywall cutting tools that cost $50 to $100. Anyway, place the tip into the drywall, then use your palm to punch it through the other side. I'm making sure to go on the outside of my lines to ensure that when I cut my piece of drywall later, a 3.5 inch square will fit without any issues. Now, this is where you do need to be more careful in a traditional wall, as you won't know what's behind it typically. Unless the hole is big enough that you can see what's inside of there, that is, but hopefully it's not that big. If you don't know if there's anything behind your wall, only use like the first inch or so of the drywall knife and carefully move it back and forth so you don't risk cutting it or hitting anything such as pipes or wires. Once all 4 lines are cut, the piece should fall. Typically it falls inside the wall and that's fine. Just leave it, there's no need to fish it out. Now it's time to get your piece of 2x4 or whatever piece of wood you're using into the wall. I typically go for 2 inches bigger on both sides of the hole, so in this case, 7.5 to 8 inches. Try to be fancy, toss and catch your drill, promptly hit yourself in the knee, hope it's not on camera, accept that it is, and carry on with putting a single drywall screw down the bottom third of the piece of wood. You do this so that way you have a screw to hold onto while sliding the piece of wood into the wall and while screwing the wood in later. If you are dealing with a larger hole, your primary focus would be to have the 4 corners supported, as the middle typically does not need any additional support. The vertical lines, so the left and right, should have screws, the horizontal does not need them. And here is how this looks from the back side. You can see that we have approximately 2 inches of wood above and below the hole in the wall. Now we need to actually screw the 2x4 into the wall so it's supported and doesn't move. This was surprisingly hard to do with the camera in front of the hole. Hindsight tells me I should have had the camera off to the side at like, I don't know, a 45-degree angle or something. Oh well. We're using 1.25" drywall screws here, so that way we have about 3/4 of an inch of screw in the wall. There are special drywall bits called dimplers that make this process easier, as you want to make sure the head of the screw is just below the surface of the drywall, but not so far that it tears through it. A dimpler makes it to where it can only go a millimeter or two below the drywall surface, which is nice. I sometimes use one, but I always seem to have to go back and recess the screw heads a little more anyway, so it's not really necessary. Just go slow when screwing in the drywall screws. Now we need to create our patch. You can buy a 4x4 sheet of drywall from Home Depot or Lowe's for like $6. It's super cheap. Far cheaper than buying a patch kit that won't work nearly as well. We want to cut the drywall patch so that it is 2 inches wider on both sides, so we'll be making a 7.5 by 7.5 inch square for the 3.5 by 3.5 inch hole. Cutting drywall is incredibly simple. Just use a straight edge and gently score the drywall with the tip of a sharp razor blade or knife. You don't need to dig into the drywall here or use excessive force. You can literally just glide the tip down hard enough to cut through the paper. Once it's cut, fold and snap the drywall along the scored line. Then use the tip of your razor blade to score the brown backing paper. Now that we have our 7.5 by 7.5 inch square cut out, and I really should have just done 8 by 8 for easier voiceover, but oh well, we need to mark out the lines for the drywall that we need to remove. The way that this patch works is we remove the drywall from behind the paper and then use the paper as our tape. It creates an incredibly strong bond with the drywall once we mud it in, and the drywall paper is thinner than traditional drywall tape, so it's easier to hide and cover up. Mark out 2 inches from each side so you end up with a tic-tac-toe board on the back of your patch. It also never hurts to remeasure the inside section to make sure it matches the hole in your wall. I always cut on the inside of my marked lines for the patch, as we want a tiny bit of wiggle room for the patch and the wall, as drywall never cuts perfectly straight, so it has jagged bits here and there. Use the tip of your razor blade to score through the back paper of your patch. Once all 4 lines have been scored, simply bend the drywall to snap the inside drywall and begin peeling it away on the outside areas from the center. It should come off fairly easily, but may leave bits and pieces that you can scrape off with your knife, or bend the drywall a bit more around those areas and it should come off. If you're wondering what that boom was, well, the lot across from me is being cleared out and they just dropped the trunk of a giant oak tree into this dumpster. The whole making of this video and this voiceover has been quite troublesome to not have too much construction sound going on in the background. Hopefully they'll finish soon. Now, before we move on to mixing up our mud or anything like that, make sure the patch fits in the hole. If it doesn't, trim is needed to the patch to get it to fit. It should effortlessly slide in without any crunching or any force. Now for supplies for doing this. Drywall joint compound. Go with the 45, 60, or 90 if you're new to drywall. 20 sets up in, well, 20 minutes, which isn't a lot of working time. You'll also need a cup for mixing your mud into, a mixing paddle, a 1.5-inch knife for getting the mud out of your cup, a 6-inch drywall knife, and a 12 or 14-inch drywall knife. The only thing not pictured here is either a drywall hawk or a trough for putting your mud into. Now we need to go ahead and mix up our drywall mud. I mixed up way too much for this and made it a hair too thin, but that's fine. As it sets up, it thickens up and works out fine. When mixing up drywall mud, or really any powders for anything, add some water first. It stops the powder from sticking to the bottom of the cup and not getting mixed up. You'll want to mix up your mud for about 15 to 30 seconds until it is all uniformly mixed and there are no clumps or dry spots. Make sure you go around the sides and bottom of the cup with your mixer to ensure that you get all of it mixed in. You can do this by hand as well, it just takes a bit more time and is a bit more effort, but it is doable. Once it's all mixed up, it's time to get the mud either into your trough or onto your drywall hawk like you'll see me use. The way that it just poured out there? Yeah, too thin. It should be able to move in the cup, but not pour out like syrup. Use your 1.5-inch knife or a spoon or whatever you want to use to get the remaining drywall mud out of the cup. Once you have your mud out of the cup, it's time to back butter the drywall patch. This is as simple as slopping the mud around the edges of the patch, so that way it will fill the gaps in the wall around it. And then add a little bit more to the back of the drywall patch itself. This will help it stick to the 2x4s as you screw it in. Once the patch is prepped, set it to the side and grab your 6-inch knife to add some more mud around the patch area. Thanks to me mixing the mud a bit thin, it's a little drippy here, but not really an issue. The main thing is to make sure you get the mud thinly on the wall, so that way the edges of the patch will have mud under it when you put it on the wall. You can also get some mud on the inside edges of the patch area here to again fill that area up. Once you have the mud on the wall, go ahead and apply the patch to the wall. It should mostly stick to the wall thanks to the mud on the back of it, but go ahead and add at least 4 drywall screws to it to permanently anchor it in place. Once it's on the wall and screwed in, grab your 6-inch knife and press down the edges of the patch, squeezing out the excess mud so that it is flat against the wall. Now, you could use this as a stopping point and just remove the excess mud around the edges and let this layer dry before putting more mud on. I decided to continue and put a sloppy coat of mud on to try and even it out, and it really wasn't working for me. With a combination of the mud being too thin and me not being at a good angle to actually apply the mud, I was struggling a bit. Normally I'm standing right where my camera is, so I was doing this a bit backwards. We'll talk more about application of the mud in the next couple of sections, where the mud has thickened up to a more usable consistency. In the meantime, enjoy watching me fail. Here we can see the back of the patched area and how the excess mud squeezed around the 2x4 to help us create a more solid patch. The mud bonds everything together for us. So it's only been about 5 minutes since I stopped recording the last section here. This is how quickly 20-minute mud can set up, and it's almost unusable, and I didn't even have the fan on to dry it out quicker. Start off with your 6-inch knife and apply a thicker coat of mud over the whole patch area. We're not necessarily going for pretty or perfect with the 6-inch knife, we're just trying to make sure that the whole area is filled with mud. Once the area is filled, grab your larger knife. While this can be done with a 6-inch knife, it is easier to get a smoother and consistent finish with a larger knife. Place the drywall knife flat at a 90-degree angle to the wall initially so it is perpendicular to the wall, and then angle it to about 45 degrees. As you begin moving across the wall, adjust the angle to make it steeper as you go. This will help you keep a consistent amount of mud on the wall and prevent it from building up on the knife as much. This is our first layer of mud, and we're not going for perfection. We're going for getting a good base layer down. We can worry about it looking good for our second layer. One thing you do want to try and do though is not create any hard edges. I did intentionally create some here, as most people will end up doing so their first few times drywalling. To prevent hard edges, apply pressure to the outside edge of the knife as you're moving it along the wall. This will essentially create a thin layer right at the edge that is flush with the wall and will minimize the amount of sanding that you have to do. Speaking of sanding, let's start off with gentle wet sanding once the mud is dry, or mostly dry. This is a drywall sponge, and it has two sides, a more aggressive white side for removing large amounts of mud at once, and a yellow side for leveling out areas. The white side can actually take off the paper of the drywall itself, so be careful with that side. Start off initially by gently going over the whole area to smooth out the mud and remove smaller lines that you may have created. Afterwards, use circular motions going towards the outside edges of your mudded area to help you cut down on any hard edges that you may have created. You don't want to sand for too long, as you can easily remove the mud you put on the wall for your first layer. On to our second and final layer. For this layer, we are trying to go for as close to perfect as we can. Now, again, I did intentionally put a couple of hard edges in this finish for sanding demonstrations, but also demonstrate the proper way to taper an edge so it won't be an issue. It just takes time to learn the proper technique to finish an edge, so don't be disheartened if you don't get it right the first few times. We start off again with the 6-inch knife to get a dollop of mud on the wall. I mixed up notably less this time and got it to the right consistency. Some would say it's the consistency of like whipped cream when it spreads when it's the right consistency. It goes on buttery smooth and it feels wonderful when it works out. However, if you're using quick mud like the 20-minute mud that I am, it can actually start to set up while you're working with it and make it more difficult, which you'll see happen here some. Also, sometimes you get debris in your mud. Just remove it with the edge of the knife or your finger or whatever, and throw that little chunk away. Let's talk mud for a moment. I will always advocate for buying powdered mud instead of buying the large buckets of mud. This is because the buckets of mud will shrink as they dry and cause cracks and craters in your finish, causing you to have to come back and put more layers on. It also takes notably longer to dry if you apply it even a little too thick. We're talking can take multiple days to dry, whereas powdered mud dries roughly in the time that it says on the bag. So on the left side here, I intentionally left a hard edge. This happens when the outside edge of your knife isn't tight against the wall, so a thicker amount of mud can build up and not be flush with the wall. You solve this by applying pressure to the outside edge of the knife as you run it along the wall, which is what I do for the right side. You can always come back with a smaller knife, such as the 6-inch knife, to taper it off if that's easier for you. If you do it with a second pass like I did on the right side, the inside edge of the knife typically is not touching the mud at all. It helps to create an even taper on the mud and minimize the amount of sanding that you'll need. And now that the mud has dried, it's time to sand it yet again. Here, I'll demonstrate 3 different methods of sanding to get rid of ridges, hard edges, and general sanding. For ridges like we have here, use your 6-inch knife and gently shave off the high spots. You can also use this method to remove much of the hard edges on the sides as well. You just have to be careful to not dig the knife into the drywall or the mud when you do so. You can also use this method before the mud has fully dried to shave it a little bit easier. Our next method is wet sanding again, which helps smooth everything out, but struggles to get rid of hard edges when they're this pronounced. That's where method number 3 comes in, actual sandpaper. Now there is actually a specific sanding block and sandpaper type for drywall, but I haven't used that thing in a decade as I like how regular paper works better. I use 220 grit on a flat disc sander by hand to smooth out hard edges. You likely don't want to use a machine sander for this as it can very quickly eat through all of your mud and then you have to go back and do a third layer. One other thing you can do if you just are struggling to get that hard edge to fully blend and feather in is to mix up a little bit more mud and taper the edge with your knife again, and then remove any ridges that may be in it after it dries. Once you're happy with how the area looks, it's time to move on to finishing. The vast majority of houses have textured walls, and the texture does help hide some imperfections. For your standard orange peel, you want to pick up Homax wall texture in a yellow can. Make sure it says water-based at the bottom. Do not get oil-based. Oil-based will bleed through your paint and be extremely visible. To get a good finish out of this stuff, you want to make sure that the can and contents are warm. If it's a nice hot day out, go set it in the sun for about 15 minutes. If it's not, fill a cup with hot water and let it soak for 10 to 15 minutes. Once it's done soaking, take it out and shake it like your life depends on it for a solid minute. If the can feels cold after shaking, soak it again. You'll notice that the little tab on it has the words heavy and fine on them. I've always used fine as it gives a nice subtle orange peel texture, whereas heavy is splotchy and gross and usually has to be flattened out afterwards. To get the best results, you want to be 12 to 18 inches away, which is about the distance from fingertip to elbow. You want to spray at an even speed, keeping the can perpendicular to the wall. Do not twist it from side to side with your wrist, or it'll cause you to have angled orange peel. It's hard to describe, but if you do it, you'll understand. You want your passes between layers to be approximately a 50% overlap to get a smooth and even coverage that doesn't look like tiger stripes. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and as always, if you like the content I'm putting out, make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all new content as it comes out. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.